Hello, I never thought I'd find myself here, writing this out as if putting it into words will somehow make sense of it all. My name's Adam. I'm 34, living in Denver, and I work as a software developer for a tech company. I've always been a pretty straightforward guy focused on my career, passionate about hiking, and content with a quiet, simple life. I met my wife, Laura, 8 years ago at a friend's wedding. She was the maid of honor, effortlessly charming, with a sharp wit and this magnetic energy that could pull anyone into her orbit. I was smitten from the start that we dated for 2 years before getting married. Life was good. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood, adopted a dog named Bruno, and settled into what I thought was a solid, happy routine. Laura worked as a marketing executive, and her job often required her to attend networking events and client meetings. I never questioned it because, well, trust was the foundation of our relationship. At least, I thought it was. The first cracks started to show about 6 months ago. Laura became distant, distracted. She was always glued to her phone, her laughter softer, reserved for text messages she wouldn't share. She'd come home late, claiming client dinners ran long or she was stuck in traffic. I noticed she was more invested in her appearance, new outfits, frequent salon visits, and oddly, a sudden interest in dental appointments. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was stress from work, I told myself. But things didn't add up. She became secretive, her phone always face down, her explanations vague. The intimacy faded, replaced by excuses about being tired or overwhelmed. The final straw was when she canceled our anniversary dinner last minute, claiming she had an urgent meeting with a client. Something felt off. The nagging suspicion grew, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt the cold grip of doubt. I didn't want to believe it, but my gut told me otherwise. The days after our missed anniversary felt like walking through a fog. Laura was distant, her excuses becoming more frequent, her affection almost non-existent. She brushed it off as stress from work, claiming that tight deadlines and demanding clients were wearing her thin. But the woman I knew, the woman I married, was slipping away, and in her place was someone I barely recognized. That I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it, that maybe the spark had just dimmed under the weight of routine. But deep down, something gnawed at me, a quiet, persistent voice whispering that there was more to the story. One evening, she came home later than usual, claiming she'd been at another client dinner. She smelled faintly of expensive cologne, the kind I didn't wear. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying it must have been from someone she brushed past in the restaurant. Her laugh sounded hollow, forced. That's when I knew. The next day, while she was in the shower, I did something I never thought I'd do. I checked her phone. It felt wrong, invasive, but I needed to know the truth. Her phone was locked, but I'd known her passcode for years. My hands trembled as I unlocked it, my heart pounding like a drum. What I found shattered me. There were texts from someone saved under the name Dr. Miller. The same name from the dentist's office she'd been visiting unusually often in the past few months. At first, I thought, maybe it's just appointment reminders or casual professional chats. But no, it was much more than that. Messages filled with inside jokes, flirtatious banter, and plans to meet outside of office hours. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. You looked stunning in that dress today. Wish I could have kept you longer. I hate when you leave. Counting down the days until our next check-up. Photos, 2 selfies of them together at restaurants, in what looked like hotel rooms, even one at a park where we used to walk Bruno. Places that had been ours. My heart raced, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak swelling inside me. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. This wasn't just a fling. She had woven this affair into the fabric of our lives, hiding it in plain sight. I closed her phone and sat there, staring at the wall, trying to process what I'd just seen. When she came out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, acting like everything was normal, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. I didn't confront her that night. I needed time to collect my thoughts, to figure out what to do next. But everything felt different now. The house was no longer a home, it was just a shell filled with lies that I spent that night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every missed sign, every time I had dismissed my instincts. How long had this been going on? Did she ever love me, or had I just been convenient, a placeholder while she lived another life behind my back? I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't ignore it anymore. The truth was there, undeniable and ugly. And soon, she'd have to face it. The next morning felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. I went through the motions, made coffee, took Bruno out for his walk, and pretended everything was normal, but inside, it felt like my chest was caving in. Laura was in the kitchen when I got back, scrolling through her phone like she hadn't detonated a bomb in our lives that I couldn't do it anymore. The pretending. The silent suffering. The invisible weight pressing down on me. I set Bruno's leash on the counter and took a deep breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She glanced up, slightly annoyed, as if I'd interrupted an important task. "About what?" I didn't dance around it. "No point." "About Dr. Miller." Her reaction was instantaneous, a slight twitch in her expression, the kind that comes when someone's been caught off guard but is trying to hide it. She quickly recovered, forcing a confused smile. "What about him?" "He's my dentist, Adam." "What's your point?" I stared at her, my jaw clenched. "Your dentist? Is that what we're calling it now?" She rolled her eyes, her usual defense mechanism when she didn't want to deal with something. "Seriously? Are you spying on me now? Going through my phone? That's a little invasive, don't you think?" I felt my blood boil. Invasive? The audacity of her flipping this on me was almost laughable. "Don't turn this around on me," I snapped, my voice rising for the first time. "You've been lying to me for months. I saw the messages, Laura. The photos. The dinner dates. The hotel rooms. So, please spare me the act." Her face hardened. The pretense of innocence vanished, replaced by something colder, more defensive. "Well, maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have needed someone else," she shot back, her words like knives. I stood there, stunned. Not because she was blaming me deep down, I expected that, but because she said it without hesitation, without remorse. It was like she'd been rehearsing it. "You think this is my fault?" I asked, my voice quieter now, not out of weakness but disbelief. She shrugged, crossing her arms. "I'm not saying it's all your fault. But you've been distant, always focused on work, on your routine. It's like you stopped caring." "Stopped caring?" I thought of the anniversary dinner she cancelled, the nights I waited up for her, the countless attempts I'd made to reconnect while she was off living another life. I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger and sadness swell inside me. "No, Laura. I didn't stop caring." "You did." She didn't respond. Just stood there, her arms crossed, her expression indifferent. That indifference hurt more than any betrayal ever could. I left the apartment that day, packing a small bag with essentials and Bruno's leash. I didn't know where I was going, just that I couldn't stay there. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me with memories that no longer belonged to the life I thought we had. I crashed at my friend Nate's place, grateful for his silent understanding. He didn't ask questions. Just handed me a beer, let me sit in silence, and occasionally muttered, "She's an idiot," which weirdly helped. That night, lying on a borrowed couch with Bruno curled up at my feet, the reality sank in. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the life I'd built, the future I'd planned, unraveling in front of me. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She'd taken the foundation of our marriage, the trust we'd built, and shattered it without a second thought. But as I stared at the ceiling, exhausted and emotionally drained, I realized something: I deserved better. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the next steps were. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. The days following that confrontation felt like a blur. a strange mixture of numbness and rage cycling on repeat. I stayed at Nate's for the first few nights, mostly because I couldn't stomach the thought of going back to the apartment. It wasn't home anymore. It was a crime scene, and every wall, every piece of furniture felt like evidence of a life that had been a lie. Nate tried to keep me distracted, inviting me to join him at the gym, suggesting we catch a game, even dragging me out for beers with some friends. But nothing really stuck. I'd be present physically, but mentally, I was somewhere else, stuck replaying that argument with Laura in my head on a constant loop. Her words haunted me. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me. Was she right? Had I been so wrapped up in work that I'd missed the signs? Was I responsible for the distance that had grown between us? It's crazy how betrayal messes with your mind, making you question not just your partner, but yourself. But then I'd remember the texts, the pictures, the lies, so many lies, and I'd feel the anger rise again, drowning out the self-doubt. She made a choice. A choice to not communicate, to sneak around, to betray everything we'd built. After about a week of crashing on Nate's couch, I knew I couldn't avoid the apartment forever. I had to face her one last time. So, I went back. The moment I stepped through the door, it felt suffocating. The place smelled the same, looked the same, but everything felt different. The framed photos on the walls were mocking me now, frozen moments of happiness that had clearly been built on a lie. Laura was there when I arrived. She looked surprised to see me, like she hadn't expected me to come back so soon. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely unfazed. No signs of remorse. No guilt. Just indifference. Back already? She asked, like I'd just run out to the store. That I didn't bother with small talk. I'm here to get my stuff. She shrugged, standing up and heading to the kitchen. Do whatever you need to do. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just cold detachment. That I packed in silence, stuffing clothes into bags, grabbing random items without much thought. Bruno followed me around, sensing the tension, his tail tucked low. It wasn't until I grabbed a photo album, one filled with memories of trips, holidays, anniversaries, that I felt the lump in my throat. All those moments. Were they real? Or was she already gone even when she was standing right beside me? As I was zipping up my last bag, Laura finally spoke. You're really leaving? I turned to look at her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She was just curious. Like she couldn't understand why her actions had consequences. Yes, I said. I'm done. She scoffed, leaning against the counter. You're being dramatic, Adam. People have affairs all the time. It doesn't mean we have to throw everything away. I stared at her, trying to comprehend how someone could be so detached, so unapologetic. That's when it hit me. She'd been gone long before I found out. Maybe not physically, but emotionally, she'd checked out of our marriage long ago. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. That I walked out, Bruno trotting beside me, leaving behind not just an apartment, but a version of my life that no longer existed. Back at Nate's, I sat in silence for a long time. The reality of it all started to settle in, not the betrayal itself, but the finality of it. This was the end of a chapter one never thought would close, but here's the thing about endings: they make space for new beginnings. That I didn't know what that looked like yet. I didn't have a plan. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something new, hope. The first few weeks after leaving Laura were the hardest. I'd always imagined heartbreak as this sharp, immediate pain, like a wound you could clearly identify and treat. But it wasn't like that. It was more like this dull, persistent ache that settled into the background of everything I did. It was in the quiet moments. The empty spaces where her absence echoed the loudest. Mornings were the worst, waking up without the familiar routines we'd built. No coffee brewing in the kitchen, no quick goodbye kisses before work, no texts throughout the day just to check in. It was strange how much you miss the little things, even when they were attached to someone who hurt you. It's like your heart hasn't caught up with your brain yet. That I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment downtown. It was nothing like the home Laura and I had shared: bare walls, mismatched furniture I found on sale, and a mattress on the floor because I couldn't bring myself to care about decorating. But it was mine. No ghosts of betrayal lurking in the corners. Just me and Bruno, figuring it out one day at a time. For a while, I went through the motions. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. My job was the only thing that kept me anchored. The structure helped, gave me something to focus on besides the endless loop of, what did I miss? How did it come to this? I drowned in those questions at night when the world got quiet and there was nothing left to distract me. I thought about therapy, but I wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Instead, I found comfort in small, mundane routines. Early morning runs with Bruno. Cooking meals from scratch, even if they didn't turn out great. Cleaning my apartment just to feel like I had control over something, and slowly, so slowly, I didn't even notice at first, I started to feel a little less broken. One afternoon, a few months after the breakup, I ran into Laura. I was at the grocery store, debating between two brands of coffee, when I heard her laugh. It was that same laugh I used to love, the one that could light up a room. I turned instinctively, and there she was standing in line with a guy I didn't recognize, her hand resting casually on his arm. She looked different. Happier, maybe. Or maybe I was just seeing her clearly for the first time without the lens of love clouding my judgment. Our eyes met for a brief moment. She gave me a polite nod, the kind you'd give to an acquaintance you barely remember, then turned back to her conversation like I was nothing more than a passing thought. I stood there for a second, waiting for the familiar punch in the gut. The anger. The sadness. The betrayal, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt nothing, and that nothingness was the most freeing feeling in the world. Later that night, as I sat on my couch with Bruno's head resting on my lap, I thought about that encounter. About how I used to believe that closure would come from some big, dramatic confrontation, some final conversation where she'd apologize, and I'd get to say all the things I'd rehearsed in my head. But closure didn't come from her. It came from me. It came from realizing that her betrayal didn't define me. That I wasn't broken because of what she did. I was healing despite it. I started seeing a therapist after that. Not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand why it had taken me so long to let go. Why I'd held on to the hurt like it was the last piece of her I had left. Therapy helped. It gave me the tools to process everything, to see the patterns, the red flags I'd ignored, the parts of myself I'd lost in the relationship. I realized that I'd been so focused on being the perfect husband that I'd forgotten to be true to myself. I started doing things I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. I took a photography class. I signed up for a hiking group and explored trails I'd never dared to try alone. I even booked a solo trip to the mountains, a place I'd always dreamed of visiting, and somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, I found myself again, not the version of me that Laura had known. A better version, stronger. Wiser. Whole. Rediscovery isn't some cinematic montage set to uplifting background music. It's not neatly packaged into milestones or dramatic breakthroughs. It's messy. It's awkward. It's sitting alone in a coffee shop, realizing you don't even know how you like your coffee because you've been ordering what she liked for years. It's stumbling through hobbies you thought would bring joy, only to find they don't fit the person you've become. But it's also where healing hides, in those small, seemingly insignificant moments. After that unexpected run-in with Laura at the grocery store, something shifted inside me. It was like the last thread tethering me to that part of my life had quietly snapped. There was no emotional breakdown, no rush of bitterness, just a strange sense of freedom. I leaned into that feeling. I signed up for a weekend photography workshop. It was something I'd always been interested in, but during my marriage, I'd convinced myself I was too busy. The first class felt awkward, like I was an imposter among people who seemed to have it all figured out. But as I adjusted the lens, focusing on the world through a new perspective, something clicked, literally and metaphorically. I started seeing beauty in things I'd overlooked before. The way light filtered through tree branches during morning walks with Bruno. The fleeting expressions of strangers lost in thought. Even the cracks in the sidewalk seemed to tell stories. It was like learning to see again. Nate, ever the loyal friend, noticed the shift. One evening, as we grabbed beers at our usual spot, he raised an eyebrow and said, "You're different." Not in a weird way, though. More like, lighter. I shrugged, unsure how to put it into words. I think I'm just done carrying things that aren't mine anymore. And that was the truth. For so long, I'd been lugging around the weight of betrayal, of unanswered questions, of trying to dissect why Laura did what she did. But none of that mattered anymore. The why wasn't my burden to bear. She made her choices, and I finally realized that her decisions didn't reflect my worth. With time, I found myself laughing more, not the forced kind you do to convince people you're okay, but genuine, from the gut laughter. It felt foreign at first, like stretching muscles I hadn't used in years. But it was real. Then came the unexpected part, meeting someone new. Her name was Sophie. We met at a local art exhibit, both awkwardly lingering too long in front of the same photograph. She had this easy energy about her, like she wasn't trying to be anything other than herself. Our conversation started with art, drifted to coffee preferences, and somehow ended with us laughing about childhood embarrassments that I didn't plan on asking for her number. I wasn't even sure I was ready to date again. But as we said goodbye, something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe hope, nudged me forward. The first date was simple: coffee at a quiet cafe. No grand gestures, no rehearsed lines. Just two people showing up as they were. I told her about my job, my newfound love for photography, and when it felt right, the story of my failed marriage. I expected the usual awkward shift, the polite nods followed by quick changes of topic. But Sophie just listened. No judgment, no pity. She simply said, "Sounds like you've been through a lot, and grown from it." That hit me harder than I expected, because for the first time, I wasn't defining myself by what I'd lost. I was recognizing how far I'd come. Sophie and I started seeing each other more often. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. There were no grand declarations or intense fireworks. It was steady, genuine, and real, built on honesty and mutual respect. One evening, as we walked Bruno along a quiet trail, she asked, "Do you ever think about her? About Laura?" I thought about it, not rushing to answer. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But not in the way I used to. It's like remembering an old scar, not because it hurts, but because it's part of the story." She nodded, squeezing my hand gently. There was no jealousy, no insecurity. Just understanding. And that's when I realized something profound: healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about reclaiming it. Owning every piece of your story, even the ones that hurt, because they shape the person you've become. As I stood there, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt it fully: peace, not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally okay with it not being perfect. Starting over is less about reinventing yourself and more about rediscovering who you've always been. I didn't realize that until I found myself genuinely happy without trying to be. Not the fragile kind of happiness that depends on someone else's presence, but the kind that's rooted in small, ordinary moments: morning sunlight spilling across the floor, Bruno's tail thumping against the couch, or the simple satisfaction of nailing the perfect shot with my camera. My life wasn't some grand narrative anymore. It was quieter, filled with things that didn't demand attention but brought comfort in their simplicity. And that was enough. Sophie and I continued to see each other, but it never felt rushed or forced. There were no expectations hanging over us, no pressure to define what we were. It was refreshing: two people meeting where they were, not where they thought they should be. She had her own past, her own scars, and somehow, that made things easier. We weren't trying to fix each other. We were just existing together, and that was more healing than any conversation about heartbreak. One evening, we found ourselves on my small balcony, the city lights flickering in the distance. We'd just returned from a local street festival, our hands still sticky from cotton candy and laughter lingering in the air. She turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if none of it happened?" If you hadn't gone through all of that? I thought about it, letting the question settle. For the first time, I didn't feel the sting of the past creeping in. Just curiosity, sometimes, I admitted. But then I think, if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be me. And I meant it. Laura's betrayal was a fracture, sure. But it was also a fork in the road, a point where my life could have stayed the same or changed for the better. I didn't see it that way at first. Back then, it was just pain, raw and consuming. But now? It was just part of the landscape, a chapter that led to something unexpected and, honestly, something better. I remembered the version of myself that had been shattered, the man who thought he needed closure to move on. But closure wasn't a destination. It wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was waking up one day and realizing you hadn't thought about the person who broke you. And when you did, it was just a passing thought, like remembering an old street you used to live on. Eventually, I stopped counting the milestones of healing. It wasn't about, today I didn't think of her, or, today I felt okay. It was just life. Full of good days and bad ones, laughter and frustration, joy and the occasional pang of memory. But the pain didn't own me anymore. Months passed, and one random afternoon, I got a message on social media. It was from Laura. Hey. I know it's been a while. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I've thought about everything, and I realize how much I hurt you. I hope you're doing well. I stared at the screen, expecting some kind of reaction. Anger? Bitterness? Even relief? But there was nothing. Just a simple acknowledgement that the past was, indeed, the past. That I didn't respond. Not because I was trying to be cold, but because there was nothing left to say. The conversation had already ended. I just hadn't realized it until now. Later that evening, Sophie noticed I was quieter than usual. She nudged me gently, her eyes full of the kind of understanding you don't have to explain. Everything okay? I nodded. Yeah. Actually. I think I'm really okay. Because I wasn't holding on anymore, and not to the anger, not to the sadness, not even to the need to prove that I'd moved on. I just had. Life kept moving, as it always does. Sophie and I planned a road trip, something spontaneous and unstructured, with no itinerary beyond, let's see where the road takes us. It felt symbolic, in a way, driving toward a future without looking in the rearview mirror. As we packed the car, Bruno hopping excitedly in the back seat, I realized I wasn't just surviving after heartbreak, that I was living, and in that realization, I found something even better than closure. I found peace. Road trips have a way of unraveling you, stripping away the noise of daily life and leaving you alone with your thoughts, even when you're not technically alone. That's what it felt like as Sophie and I drove through winding roads, windows down, the breeze tangled in Bruno's ears as he stuck his head out, living his best dog life. There was no real plan, just a vague idea to head west and see where the road would take us. We stopped at quirky roadside diners, the kind with faded signs and questionable coffee, but somehow the pancakes always tasted better than anything back home. We hiked trails that weren't on any map, discovered small towns where strangers greeted us like old friends, and spent nights under starlit skies, wrapped in blankets and quiet conversations. And somewhere along those miles, between the laughter and comfortable silences, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: lightness. Not the temporary escape kind, but the genuine, deep in your bones kind that comes when you realize you've let go of things you didn't even know you were carrying. One evening, we camped by a secluded lake. The water was still, reflecting the fading hues of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. We sat by the fire, the crackle of burning wood filling the spaces between our words. Sophie tossed a pebble into the lake, watching the ripples spread out, and then she turned to me, her expression thoughtful. Do you ever think about who you were before all of this? It was a simple question, but it hit differently. I stared at the water for a moment, letting the question settle. Yeah, I said quietly. But it feels like thinking about someone else. Like an old friend you lost touch with. And it was true. The man I was before the betrayal, the one who thought he had it all figured out, felt distant. But not in a sad way. More like I'd outgrown him, like I'd evolved into someone new, shaped by experiences I never would have chosen but that had somehow carved out space for growth. Sophie didn't press for more. She just nodded, understanding without needing an explanation. That's what I appreciated most about her. She never tried to fix me or fill the gaps. She just existed alongside me, letting me be, and somehow, that was exactly what I needed. Later that night, as I lay staring at the sky, I thought about Laura, not with anger, not with sadness, just as a memory. A chapter in my story. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't afraid of that chapter anymore. I didn't have to pretend it didn't exist. It did. It shaped me. But it didn't define me. The next morning, we packed up and hit the road again. As the miles stretched behind us, I felt like I was leaving more than just a campsite. I was leaving behind the last remnants of the weight I'd been carrying. Eventually, we made it to a small coastal town, the kind where time seems to slow down. We found a little cafe by the beach, and as we sat there, sipping coffee with the salty breeze in the air, I realized something profound. Happiness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sneaks in quietly, disguised as ordinary moments, like a road trip with someone who makes you feel seen, like the taste of slightly burnt toast that somehow feels perfect, like a dog's head sticking out of a car window, tongue lolling, reminding you to enjoy the ride. That I didn't need closure from Laura anymore. I didn't need answers or apologies. I'd found something better. I'd found myself. As we packed up to head back home, Sophie looked at me, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You seem different," she said. I nodded, returning the smile. "I think I am. Because sometimes, the biggest transformations aren't loud or dramatic. They happen quietly, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the miles you put between who you were and who you've become." And as we drove back, I realized I wasn't just moving on, that I was moving forward. Coming home after that road trip felt different, like I'd crossed some invisible threshold without realizing it. The apartment was the same coffee mugs in the cabinet, same slightly crooked photo frame on the wall, same Bruno claiming his spot on the couch, but I wasn't the same. It wasn't that the trip had magically fixed everything. Healing doesn't work like that. It's not a destination, it's a process, a series of small shifts you only notice when you look back and realize how far you've come. The road trip didn't erase the past, but it put distance between me and the parts of it that no longer served me. I slipped back into my routine, but it didn't feel like the lifeline it had been after the breakup. Work was just work, not a distraction from pain. Mornings with Bruno weren't filled with silent overthinking, they were just mornings. And that quiet? That stillness? It was no longer deafening. It was peaceful. One day, I was cleaning out my inbox, deleting old emails, when I stumbled upon a folder labeled Us. It was filled with emails Laura and I had exchanged over the years, sweet notes, plans for the future, random grocery lists. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the delete button. Part of me expected to feel something: bitterness, regret, maybe even sadness, but all I felt was gratitude, not for the betrayal, obviously, but for the clarity it had given me. For the lessons I'd never have learned if my life had stayed on the path I thought was meant for me. Her leaving didn't break me. It freed me. It forced me to confront the parts of myself I'd been neglecting, the dreams I'd put on hold, the comfort zones I'd mistaken for security. I deleted the folder without fanfare. No dramatic sigh, no symbolic moment. Just a click, and it was gone because it didn't define me anymore. Sophie noticed the change in me, too. We were having dinner at this little Italian place we discovered together, nothing fancy, just good food and soft lighting. In the middle of telling her about a new photography project I'd picked up, she reached across the table, resting her hand over mine. "You're different," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine. "Lighter." I thought about that for a second. She was right. I was lighter, not because I'd let go of the past, but because I'd stopped letting it hold me down. "I think I finally forgave myself," I replied. She tilted her head, curious. "For what?" For staying in something that was already broken. For ignoring the signs. For believing I wasn't enough when the truth is, she wasn't. Saying it out loud felt like releasing the last bit of weight I didn't even know I was carrying. Forgiveness is tricky. We often think it's about the other person, about making peace with what they did. But the real work is internal. It's about forgiving yourself for the role you played, even if that role was just believing in the wrong person. As the days turned into weeks, I realized that healing isn't about reaching some perfect, untouched version of yourself. It's about embracing the cracks, the scars, the lessons etched into your skin like a roadmap of where you've been. It's about looking in the mirror and seeing not what you lost, but what you found. I found courage in the places that scared me. I found strength in the moments I thought would break me. I found love, not the kind you search for in someone else, but the kind that grows quietly within you when you stop searching. One evening, I found myself standing by the window, watching the city lights flicker like stars that had fallen just for me. Bruno was asleep at my feet, his soft snoring filling the room. Sophie was in the kitchen, humming a tune I didn't recognize but found comforting anyway, and that's when it hit me: this is it, not some grand finale. Not the closure I once thought I needed. Just life, in all its imperfect, beautiful simplicity. I wasn't waiting for happiness anymore. I was living it. Life has a way of surprising you, not with big, dramatic events, but with quiet moments that sneak up when you least expect them. It's not the grand milestones that mark growth, but the simple, everyday realizations that you're no longer the person you used to be. And that's how I knew I'd healed, not because something happened, but because it didn't. One morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping softly against the windows. Bruno was curled up at my feet, snoring like he'd run a marathon in his sleep. I reached over, instinctively checking my phone, not for messages from Laura, not anymore, but just out of habit. No pit in my stomach, no lingering thoughts about the past. Just me, the rain, and the quiet comfort of an ordinary day. Sophie was still asleep, her breathing steady, her presence peaceful. I watched her for a moment, not with the fear I used to carry, fear of losing, of being betrayed again, but with gratitude. Not for her fixing me, because she didn't. She never tried. I fixed myself. That realization felt like standing at the edge of something vast, not an abyss, but an open field. Boundless. Full of possibilities. I thought back to the man I was after the betrayal, lost, angry, drowning in questions. I wanted to go back and tell him, "You're going to be okay. Better than okay." But maybe he needed to walk through that darkness to find the light on his own. Later that day, Sophie and I went for a walk with Bruno. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening, reflections of the sky puddled at our feet. As we strolled, Sophie squeezed my hand gently and said, "You seem at peace." I smiled, realizing it was true. Not the fragile peace that feels like it could shatter with the wrong word, but the kind that's rooted deep, unshaken by the echoes of the past. "You know," I said, "I used to think closure came from the person who hurt you. Like, I thought I needed some big apology or explanation to move on." "And now?" she asked, tilting her head. "Now I know closure isn't something you get from someone else. It's something you give yourself." She nodded, her thumb brushing over my knuckles. There was nothing more to say, because some truths don't need to be unpacked, they just need to be felt. We reached a small park, the grass still damp from the rain. Bruno ran ahead, chasing imaginary squirrels, his tail wagging like he'd never known anything but joy. Watching him, I realized he had the right idea. Dogs don't dwell on the past. They live fully in the moment, unapologetically present. Maybe we could learn something from that. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt it, not just peace, but contentment. The kind that doesn't rely on someone else's validation, that doesn't need to be chased or earned. It just exists. For so long, I thought the end of my marriage was the end of something permanent. But it wasn't the end at all. It was just a plot twist, a necessary detour on the way to something better. I learned that heartbreak doesn't define you. How you rise from it does. I learned that forgiveness isn't about absolving the person who hurt you. It's about releasing yourself from the weight of carrying them in your heart, and most importantly, I learned that healing isn't a destination you arrive at with a neatly packed bag. It's a journey, a road trip without a map, full of wrong turns and unexpected stops, but somehow, you end up exactly where you need to be. As Sophie and I sat on a park bench, watching Bruno chase his shadow, I realized I was exactly where I needed to be. No more looking back. No more what ifs. Just here, living, loving, free.